Hey everybody, this is Andrew McKenzie-DeFranza from Harborlight Homes here. Just checking in today and had some thoughts I wanted to share. There was an article that came out the other day in the Globe. This is February 15th by Andrew Brinker about a project in Wellesley where the state wanted to redevelop a parking lot that Mass Bay College has right now and create affordable housing on that parking lot, which would also allow the college to invest in its programming for its students. So the college is controlling it. They would sell it through the state process and invest in the campus. Seems like a pretty good win-win. Wellesley, a place where there's not a lot of affordability, would get some affordable homes. The college would get some money and invest in their campus, and it would be in an area seemingly that was not stressful to people nearby. But that's not how it went, which I'm sure you're not surprised by. So I wanted to reflect on a couple of the things that they that they mentioned in this article, because it really sort of it got into my head a little bit, and there were some things in here that I thought were important. So a few of the easier points, and then we'll get into some of the harder things, I think. Now, one of the things I think we want to share is that the article points out that we all know we're in a housing crisis, which is why the prices continue to go up so high, because we have not built at a significant enough pace to match our population for decades. And a lot of that has to do with zoning and land use control, which is what the whole MBTA law was about, was to try to create more opportunities for there to be places where things could be developed near transit. Makes sense. Good for the environment, good for people who need the homes, and important for the economy. So we're thinking about how that's possible. And so one of the things the article mentions is that everybody agrees we have a problem and that we need to build more housing. It's consistent. Everybody agrees with that, more or less. And what ends up happening, though, there are two or three things that are pretty common. So the first one is that everybody agrees in the abstract. So that's one of the things Mr. Brinker, the reporter, comments on, is that everybody agrees we have a problem and that we need to solve it. And then what happens is, as soon as it moves from the abstract, what you end up with, which is a comment that one of my friends always makes, is I'm really supportive of affordable housing, just not here. And so you see in this article, one of the lines is, there are places where it is appropriate to build housing, and I don't believe this is one of them. In our experience, that's been pretty common, that what happens is it really doesn't matter how good the site is or where it is or what it is. Someone is always going to say, I'm really supportive of this in the abstract, but in the concrete, actually doing something about the problem we have always is a problem to someone. And in this case, you can see from some of the Wellesley residents, there are places where it is appropriate to build housing, and I don't believe this is one of them. Part of what we wanted to tell you is this happens all the time. we get this pretty much every single time somebody says, can't you do it somewhere else? And the answer is it has to be done somewhere. The second thing that often happens is that people will raise a technical concern. Water, traffic, something about height or trees. So one of the things we try to do, and generally do I think fairly well, is work with the neighbors early and for a long time to help solve any technical concerns they might have. Do they need the lighting to be a little different? Do they need landscaping to be in a different place? Do we need to move something that would be better for them? In this case, you don't have a lot of near neighbors. What you do have is a near piece of land that is a forest that the state also owns, or that the college owns via the state. And people use that for hiking, which is great. And the state has been clear there is no intent to develop the forest, just the parking lot. And they offered a solution for people who are nervous, including the land trust in the town, that they could put a conservation restriction on the land. So you have land right now that's wide open. They could develop the site, but they're willing to put a restriction on it, which would solve the problem of people's concern that the forest is going to get developed and preserve that for generations for the wider public. But the comment response to that is, no, that's not sufficient. We don't want the state to build on the parking lot either. We don't want the parking lot or the forest to be in this bid process, which I think then lets you know that the issue was really not about the forest, and we find this often to be the case. The issue is not always about the technical item. The technical item is used as sort of a smokescreen for how do we block this housing, especially if it's affordable housing, especially if it's going to provide opportunity for access to very affluent communities based on race and class. Then people come up generally with a lot of issues, and if you solve those issues, it turns out there's not the solution. By way of example, I'll give you this. We were working on a project years and years ago, 20 acres. We were going to build 108 units in small little buildings along 20 acres, right? So less than 10 units an acre, much less than 10 units an acre. And we were going to build it out, and we were working with one of the near neighbors, and we said, well, we were trying to figure out what would he feel comfortable with. We were doing what we do, right? Talking to him, do you need this, do you need that, should we move it, make it lower, move the design? So we brought him into a meeting and said, what would you need? We said, can we do 90 units instead of 100? Can we do 80? Can we do it in this size or that size? And we got all the way down, for the sake of argument, to say, what if we just built one single unit, one affordable unit? And you know what he said? No, that would not be acceptable. On 20 acres, one unit. It was never about the volume or the design or the location, right? It was about this is what he didn't want. Which really leads me to the last part, and then I'll end with some good news. But the real thing that got our attention in this article, if you look at the end of the article, they have a problem, they want to redo the site, they want to put affordable housing there. And if you look at the end of it, this is the quote you hear. When people buy into a town, often investing their life savings, there is an implied contract where that family is saying, I'm buying your services, said Tobin. And they're buying into the school system and the feel of the town. And when the town or the state decides they're going to change the rules, people get upset. And the language I really want to draw your attention to, especially in this month of the year, with what it's honoring and what it's supporting, is the implied contract language. Implied contract. And this is what we often find. There is a sense, especially in the more affluent suburbs or the more affluent communities, that they should have, that they're entitled to, in fact, a level of control to control entry into their community and to enforce exclusion. This is, you'll probably sometimes hear us refer to this as the idea of being able to use municipal forces to create a gated community. This is, of course, not a gated community in Florida. This is a public municipal town. This is a municipality. Individuals do not have the right to essentially suggest that they can control who comes in and who comes out and who can participate. And so instead, we have used historically zoning, land use restrictions, infrastructure restrictions. If we go all the way back, we also used racial covenants and other forms of racial exclusion. If you're curious about this, we would encourage you to check out The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which is a book that has come out a number of years ago but has been very influential. We'd be happy to send you a copy if you drop us a note. Send you a copy. The logic being that the intent originally was to exclude, even 100 years ago when we were into all of these exclusions based on deed restrictions and covenants that would block people by race and class and a variety of races, that is manifested in the current reality under land use zoning, which is why changes to land use zoning were critical to try to mitigate long histories of harm. But what I really wanted to get to the point today was to say this idea, this common sort of collective spiritual idea almost in our consciousness, that there is an implied contract. I'd like to ferret that out a little bit and say what we're really saying is that among the people who live in a community, they have an implied contract to each other that they will collaborate to create this exclusivity and to continue the ongoing harm that has been going on and on and on for decades and decades and decades. And this should not be allowed. We should not be able to use a public good, meaning a municipality's resources, rules, requirements, to inflict an ongoing or preserve an ongoing harm to someone else. This should not be an allowable use of a public good. Public goods are for public goods. You cannot use a public asset to create a public harm, especially in this case, when the land is not owned by the town and when it is allowable to do what is being proposed. It should be allowed to be done. So if we're looking really for solutions and we're looking for places to create solutions, we're going to have to stomach the idea that this implied contract, which is really our common heart condition as a society, is a huge part of the problem. And these different ways that we have manifested rules to enforce our implied contract are really just the outgrowths of what we really mean to do, which is what we're saying we mean to do is we can control who lives here and who doesn't. and who has proximity to whom and who has access to what kind of schools, what kind of water. You'll note in the language it says we're buying into your school system. Coded language. One of the things we often hear when we're permitting affordable housing in a community is a lot of stress about who's going to go to the school, especially if there are any implications around race or class. Then you often hear people very stressed about how that's going to go. So we need to get at this implied contract idea. If we aren't able to get into the part that's in our minds and in our spirits to cure the idea about who gets to control who lives where, we're going to continue to manifest rules and forces as a society that continue to enforce these things that advantage some people and disadvantage others. We have to get to the idea that our implied contract is more broad. We have a human implied contract. Our implied contract is more broad and should be more inclusive than a limited idea around, I have purchased, this is what the language says, I am buying your services. We didn't buy into a gated community. There are no gated cities or towns. And it doesn't have the ability to be bought, or it shouldn't. So I encourage you in this month, as we're celebrating Black History Month, that people would think about how we have ended up in the various segregated ways we have based on cities and towns, and this idea of an implied contract. What is your implied contract or mine? We all have thoughts about this. And what is the implied contract we really want to have as a society? If you're thinking about this, think about what is your implied contract you have with your neighbors. What is mine? We all have some sense of implied contract. I expect to respect and care for my neighbors and them for me and for my family. I think that makes sense. But if the implied contract is we have all together banded together with our resources and bought into a community so we control who can be here and who cannot, I'm not sure that's what we mean to do. It doesn't sound very American, does it? It doesn't sound very democratic. It doesn't sound that way. And so at least I would offer an alternative version of the view of society, which is I think the implied contract is we should be treating each other with respect. We should be providing opportunity for the children in our communities to grow and to pursue dreams that they might have and hopes and to succeed with their education and their economics. I think we should be thinking about view of community around those who are aging, being able to safely do that in communities that they help build up, and those who have maybe other kinds of challenges, that they have a safe place in the community where they can be and participate. That's a different kind of view of the implied contract. But I wanted to raise that and say it is the implied contracts in our minds and in our spirits that are driving our public policy. And if we want to get down a level, this gentleman happened to raise the issue, and I wanted to raise it for you, which is it is the implied contract that we're after. This is the part we have to think about and we have to change. So again, if you're curious, please send us a note. We'll put a little tag at the end of this video. We'd be happy to send you a copy of Richard Rothstein's book. If you're curious about some of the racial covenants and deed restrictions that enforced racial segregation 100 years ago and ongoing, please feel free to check out the Dirty Deeds Project on our website, harborlighthomes.org. There's a whole set of information there, and there's some legislation going on right now in Massachusetts to try to eradicate those deeds across the state. While they're not legally enforceable, they remain offensive and are a reminder of how we got here. So would encourage you to think about implied contracts, what kind of society you want and I want, and what we're all hopeful for, and that we're doing what we mean to do.